All right, welcome to the podcast, Nat. How are you going?
Thank you. I'm going well. It's lovely to be on the other side of a podcast recording.
Yeah, it's awesome. I've been meaning to reach out to you for ages, so I'm really looking forward to what you've got to share with us today.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to what questions you're going to ask me, Jin. It's a bit of a choose your own adventure, I feel.
All right, can you just tell my audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, I guess, gosh, where do I start? I'm a Leo, so you'll probably have to stop me speaking about myself at some point.
I've heard
But
about
basically,
Leos and how they love to celebrate their
yeah.
birthdays and maybe
Yes, my
some
birthday is
perfume.
next week, if anyone's wondering. No one would be wondering that. So I am a holistic dietitian and nutritionist, and have done further study in herbal medicine, in yoga teacher training, and in fitness instructing. And I have a particular passion for thyroid health, for gut health, and for hormonal health, and very much has come from personal struggles in all of those areas, and I just find it all so fascinating. So I guess that's me in a professional nutshell.
Cool, that's nice and brief.
Yeah, I thought so. I can tell you more if you like.
Can you tell me what's the difference between a dietitian and a nutritionist?
It's a great question. Technically, the main difference is that dietitians can practice in hospital settings and can kind of treat certain diseases, like certain disease states, whereas a nutritionist, they can't necessarily practice in like that hospital setting. And there is usually, to become a dietitian, you have to do an extra 2 years of masters, or there's a different type of undergrad that you do as well.
So did you start off as a nutritionist and then go into dietetics?
No, I just did the straight nutrition and dietetics degree. So you kind of, when you're a dietitian, you can call yourself a nutritionist as well in Australia. So
Mm,
as long as it hasn't changed, as far as I'm aware, since back in 2013, I think, or 14, I graduated.
cool. And you study herbal medicine?
Yeah, so naturopathy, I've made it maybe 3/4 of the way through the degree. It's just a bit of a balancing act between studying, like continuing to do that study, and running my business, and still having a life. So I can't call myself a naturopath yet, but I definitely practice far more naturopathically than I do as a traditional dietitian or nutritionist.
Cool. So why did you want to go into naturopathy?
To be honest, because it was the way I was practicing, and in order to kind of be recognized as a naturopath and identify under, I guess, the label of what would accurately describe the way I approach treatment, and also to be able to be what's it called? Like, be a member of an association. I can't be a member of any association here as a dietitian except for the DAA, which is the Dietitians Association of Australia, and I don't want to be part of them. And so it was really just about formalizing my knowledge that I'd kind of informally gotten in the way of naturopathy from doing so much further education and working for a supplement company that was herbal medicine and nutraceutical based. So it was a bit of a mix. I just find natural medicine so effective, and it is essentially a big part of what not saved me, but helped me get well again as well.
Oh, great. And you're passionate about helping people with lots of areas in their health, but what's the main area for you that you love to help people in?
I'd say thyroid health is the main one, but it's a bit of it's a funny answer to give, because healing a thyroid requires healing the gut, healing the hormones, addressing the immune system. I think of the thyroid as like the canary in the coal mine, and it's kind of goes out, and you have to go searching for, well, what are the underlying root causes that have caused that to dysfunction. So I guess thyroid health, but by default, it ends up being looking at the gut and the immune system. And emotions, I feel, play a big role, though I don't necessarily do that work myself. I work in shared care teams to try and help people move through a lot of that as well.
Mm. So can you tell us a little bit about thyroid conditions?
Yeah, so basically, there are a whole range of thyroid conditions, and I would say, as a generalized statement, there's most people know it as either you have an underactive thyroid or an overactive thyroid. And underactive thyroids are far more common than overactive thyroids. And within the category of having an underactive thyroid, there can be lots of different reasons why that occurs. One common reason is that someone has Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune version of an underactive thyroid where the body is mistakenly attacking the thyroid gland and affecting its function. And then there can be other really common examples of an underactive thyroid where it's not necessarily being driven by the immune system, but it might be driven by stress. And that could be environmental, chemical, emotional, physical. It could be driven by nutrient deficiencies, by infections, or overgrowth. So that could be coming from the gut, could be driven by your environment. So mold can be a big trigger for thyroid issues as well. So there's lots of varying ways that a thyroid issue can be expressed. And I guess getting to the root cause of it is what I'm really passionate about, because I think that's what modern medicine misses out on, is it just kind of slaps a Band-Aid on things. And plenty of people are on thyroid hormone replacement or thyroid medication but still feel like complete crap. And that ends up happening until you can actually find and address the underlying root causes for them.
Now, I always forget to do this, but can you explain what the thyroid actually does and what is it?
Yeah. Yes. I know it's so hard. It's kind of, when you talk about it so much, it's assumed knowledge. So it is a butterfly-shaped gland that sits in your neck, and it's basically responsible for the energy of every single cell in your body. So all your cells have receptors for thyroid hormones, so they're like doorways, and the thyroid hormones themselves are like keys. And in order for all of your systems in your body to actually run, you need enough thyroid hormones, because it's kind of like the fuel, the petrol in the car, and it is the energy that makes everything happen, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Good. You're good with the quick descriptions.
I'm doing my best for you.
Simple. You talked a bit about underactive thyroid. Can you talk about overactive thyroid and the medicine that might be given for that condition?
Totally. So an overactive thyroid is generally the complete opposite to an underactive one, where instead of everything being turned down in the body, everything is turned up. So it's kind of like you have put far too much fuel in your car, and it's just everything is running overtime. And the main causes for an overactive thyroid are Graves' disease, which is the autoimmune version of an overactive thyroid. So kind of opposite to Hashimoto's in the symptoms that are experienced, because it causes an increase in thyroid hormones as opposed to a decrease. But essentially at the root of it is a dysregulated immune system. So it comes back to the same things and often the same underlying root causes that I mentioned before in terms of stress and nutrient deficiencies, etc. And then you can definitely still have an overactive thyroid without having Graves' disease. And sometimes that can occur because of goiters, which are like growths on the thyroid gland. And those would be the most common kind of forms of an overactive thyroid. Sometimes it can be triggered post-pregnancy, and that's called postpartum thyroiditis, where there's inflammation of the thyroid gland and there's a turning up of thyroid hormone production. And sometimes that normalizes and goes away, and sometimes it hangs around or triggers one of those two autoimmune conditions I mentioned before, so Hashimoto's or Graves' disease in some women.
So for people out there, because thyroid conditions or imbalances are pretty common, can you take us through what the symptoms would be for, firstly, an underactive thyroid or Hashimoto's?
Yeah, so fatigue would be a really big one. So fatigue, inability to lose weight or putting on weight despite not changing anything or despite your best efforts, feeling like you can't think clearly, so brain fog, poor hair growth, poor nail growth, dry skin, getting any kind of like carpal tunnel syndrome, joint pain or muscle weakness can be another one. Constipation is definitely one that I see a lot as well. And feeling low, so feeling like unmotivated or having depression, or also actually anxiety is another one that pops up a fair bit. So there's a lot of different symptoms. I'd also say something that happens a lot in people who have an underactive thyroid is that when I say fatigue, it's the kind of fatigue where even if you get a good amount of sleep, like say you've got your 8 hours and it was uninterrupted, you still wake up feeling tired and like you haven't been rested. You can also get heavy periods or painful periods with it. And you can definitely have fertility issues as well, because it's really important in fertility and holding a pregnancy full term. So miscarriages are definitely higher in people with an underactive thyroid and can be a red flag. And the other one I would say is often you feel quite fluidy, so quite puffy. And sometimes that will be hard to identify as a practitioner looking at someone, because if I'm seeing them for the first time, it might just seem like, well, that's their normal. But often people know themselves and they'll describe themselves as feeling like they've got water bags strapped to their bodies, or they feel generally quite puffy in their face.
What about overactive thyroid?
Yes. So overactive, generally what I see most of the time is anxiety, heart palpitations, insomnia, so feeling wired but tired, excessive sweating, so just noticing that all of a sudden you are sweating more than you usually would, and during times when that usually wouldn't happen as well. And I would say those could be the main ones. Sometimes people experience like loose stools or diarrhea as well, because if you can imagine that everything has just been turned up in your body. So generally you feel, the experience is that you feel wired and you feel out of control of your body.
Do you know much about Ayurvedic doshas?
I don't know enough to speak on it. I know what the doshas are, but I have no idea what I am. But no, I am fascinated by that, and that's my next thing to investigate after I finish my naturopathy degree, along with a billion other things. But why do you ask? Do you know something to share?
Yeah, so I love pulling on the Ayurvedic philosophies when I'm looking at my clients. So I'll pull on many philosophies: Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, Western medicine, all sorts of things. But what I love about it is that they are called doshas, and there's 3 of them: Vata, Pitta, Kapha. And it describes the person's physical structure, so what they look like with their stature and their weight, all that kind of stuff, their general appearance, but it also describes their personality type. But what's really interesting is that it also categorizes these doshas or body types to be more predisposed to certain medical conditions and health issues than others. So the Vata type personality or dosha is the really thin, wiry type person, quite lean, and their personality tends to be quite quick and rapid, and they have a tendency to be affected by tremors and irritability. They get really agitated by the wind, and their personality or emotion tends to be affected by anxiety, which is that hyperthyroid that you're talking about. So the Vata person tends to get more thyroid issues, particularly the hyperthyroid. And then sometimes it burns out and they go hypothyroid, and then they start to gain all the weight. But I think it's really interesting, and I might ask you in a minute just about the personalities that you notice who tend to get the hyper versus the hypothyroid. But I highly recommend you look into the doshas. There's a really awesome book that I recommend everyone reads called Perfect Health by Deepak Chopra. And he's a medical doctor. But again, people going to try and fix their thyroid issues using medications, blah, 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 all these other sorts of things, but really coming back to understanding their own true nature and their natural constitution, and balancing things like sleep, which I know that you recommend to people, the environment that they live in, the people that they surround themselves with, to try and bring their health back into balance, but also just their expression of themselves as well.
Yeah, I think I'm so interested in Ayurvedic medicine because I think it is such a fascinating way to look at dis-ease in the body, and I definitely would say I see types of people getting an overactive thyroid. I feel like they are very much the anxious kind of people pleasing people, like types of people. Although I do find it hard to kind of differentiate between who gets what, because I also see that a lot in underactive thyroid presentations. I often see those being the people without very firm boundaries or any boundaries at all, the givers, the people who are really kind of martyrs about being providing for their families. Like I see a lot of women in particular who have just given and have a really hard time saying no and setting boundaries, and who have a lot of really deep negative self-talk. And that's what I would say, that's a really common theme.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so on that, the kapha type people, they're the more solid built or your endomorph type people, and they will tend to store weight. So that comfort eating, and that's that low thyroid where they tend to gain weight, even though they might not be eating that much on the emotional level, but also fluid retention as well. And the natural personality of the kapha person is they love to give out their support and nurture, or sometimes over nurture and smother people, but they do it at their own expense. Whereas they love to have support as well. So it's awesome that, you know, you run your group and there is that community and tribe mentality.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it? How you see themes happening when you're treating certain conditions.
Yeah. And you're probably a pitter, by the way, because you're so driven.
There you go. I've always wondered what I was. And you know why I've found it so hard to figure out is because it's so heavily based on, well, I shouldn't say that because I don't know enough about it, but when I've been reading about it at a real surface level, often when I'm trying to figure out what I am looking at the physical presentations, and they're like, well, what is your natural body type or natural XYZ? And because I've struggled so much with disordered eating when I was growing up, I have a really hard time figuring out, well, what was my natural weight or build, because I interfered with it from a very young age.
Mm. Oh, interesting. Well, we're going to go into that later, aren't we?
Yes, we will.
So personality type, quite hard on themselves and giving out a lot of their energy, anxious, some of them depressed. So how does someone get tested for their thyroid?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, how does someone get tested properly for their thyroid is probably a really good way to phrase that question, because anyone can go into their doctor, like their medical doctor, and say, can you please test my thyroid? And what will happen is that the doctor, usually, unless they are particularly integrative or more holistically minded, will order what's called a TSH, which is basically stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. And it's a hormone that is released from your brain and tells your thyroid, hey, thyroid, produce thyroid hormones in this amount. This is how much I need based on what is already circulating in my body. So we can already see that, well, that's a bit of a problem, because when you're only measuring a TSH, all we're being told is what is the brain telling the thyroid, not what is the thyroid actually doing. And so in terms of proper thyroid testing, what you need to request, and this won't always be followed through with, and I'll tell you ways around that, but asking for a TSH, a free T4, and a free T3. And the free T4 and the free T3 are actually the thyroid hormones themselves. So free T4 being the kind of inactive thyroid hormone that needs converting to the free T3. So think of T4 as being like money in the bank, and T3 as being your spending money that actually makes transactions happen. So makes processes in the body happen, makes you feel like you have enough energy as well. And so that's really important to get tested. And I also always recommend people get their thyroid antibodies done. So that's checking for whether or not there is any dysregulation in your immune system. So is your immune system attacking your thyroid or some process in that thyroid hormone production steps? So often what will happen is you'll only get a TSH done if you just say, can you test my thyroid? Sometimes you might get a T4 if you're lucky. And that's just because in Australia and New Zealand, that is the way that it's kind of set up. That those are the rules, so to speak, when it comes to how do doctors test for thyroid hormones. Now, the first step that I encourage people to do is ask, can you please test T4 and T3 as well as the antibodies? And if sometimes doctors will agree to that and they'll say, okay, that's fine. Other times they'll say, no, that's not necessary. And if they say that, the first thing I encourage people to say is, well, if I pay out of pocket for it, will you measure it? And sometimes the doctor will say, yes, that's fine. Other times they'll say no, because they don't want to be red flagged for ordering tests, quote unquote, unnecessarily. So if you get in that situation, the other couple of options you have are working with a naturopath or nutritionist or holistic practitioner that is skilled in interpreting thyroid hormone results. And if that isn't an option, then you can actually order thyroid hormone testing yourself through private testing labs. Though I would say with that, it's one thing to get something tested, but it's another thing to actually understand how to interpret them. And there is definitely an art to interpreting thyroid hormone results because we're looking at a system. And so we're really interested in what's the brain telling the thyroid to do, what is the thyroid actually doing, and is the body able to convert between the inactive and the active thyroid hormone, and matching that up with symptoms as well, because you might be in a situation where you can produce enough thyroid hormones and that system is working well, but you have all these symptoms of an underactive thyroid. And to me, that tells me that the thyroid hormones you're producing can't actually get into the cell. And then we need to find out, well, why is that happening? And there isn't necessarily a direct test for that. That's where the art and science of being a practitioner and working with a real human and understanding matching symptoms to pathology is really important.
And not just prescribing the medication in the hope that it's going to balance things out, because that doesn't always happen. I know people who come in and they say, I'm taking my thyroxine, but my levels are just going up and down. And so they just keep on adjusting the levels.
Yes, definitely. And I think, there's a time and a place for thyroid medication, but it certainly isn't all of the time. And often there's a point at which, for some people, if they need it, it helps, and then they won't be able to get any further. And they end up being on exactly that path that you're saying of just constantly adjusting up and down and not getting any stability. And it feels really unsettling in their body and mind, I would say.
And the other thing that I think is important to note is different types of practitioners. So your conventional practitioners versus people like functional medicine, integrative GPs or naturopaths or nutritionists, they look at the normal range quite differently, don't they?
Yeah. So thyroid hormone levels, so for TSH, for T4 and T3, the ones I mentioned before, the reference ranges for those are very large or very wide, meaning that they call normal something like their idea of what normal is far greater than what normal actually feels like and what optimal feels like in someone's body. So, for example, TSH is probably the classic one there, where the normal reference range or the conventional reference range goes from about 0.5 to 4.5. And what I see in clinical practice, and what's also reflected in much of the research, is that really for optimal health, we're looking at it being between about 1 and 2 to 2.5. And if you're someone who is actively trying to conceive or going to be on that path in the near future, then it's actually really important that your TSH is below 2, because we know that a TSH above 2 doubles the risk of miscarriage, and it is something that's important to get right before going into trying to conceive as well, because it's a preventable thing that we can absolutely control and influence in a really positive way. And I think with the T4 and the T3 values, it's a similar kind of situation where the reference ranges are quite large, but what we see being optimal is a little bit smaller than that. And I think that's something to take into consideration. And I think what people don't realize is that a lot of the time reference ranges are developed, and this is not all the time, but a lot of the time reference ranges are developed based on the average of people going into that pathology lab and getting tests done, which means that, you know, you're getting an average of unwell people, right? Because who mostly goes to the pathology lab to get their blood tested? It's people who aren't feeling well, and then you get the average of those people, and we call that normal.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, thanks for clearing that up, because I know that's a big question that a lot of people have and they struggle with in terms of getting the right testing done, and they often have to really strongly advocate for themselves, and they have to say, I'll pay for the test. And then even then, sometimes the doctors will convince them not to go ahead with it. But these people want answers for why they're feeling so rubbish.
Yeah, 100%. I feel that frustration every day, every day.
Because they often come to you at the end of the line because they're not getting answers from other people, right?
Yep, exactly, exactly.
So what do you do when you work with someone with thyroid issues?
So basically, my whole goal is to get to the root cause. So find out what is exactly driving their underactive thyroid, or their form of an underactive thyroid, and then treating those underlying issues. So they're all the root causes that I mentioned before in relation to infections, or which could be coming from the gut or otherwise, and they could be bacterial or viral. It could be treating nutrient deficiencies, addressing the immune system that's dysregulated, looking at food intolerances or things that they're reacting to, and basically just trying to bring down inflammation in their body and bring down the stress load in their body, including the stress of stored emotions, stored trauma. And that's something that I refer out for, but bring awareness to and make them realize that that's part of their story. And as well, environmental stress in terms of reducing toxic load. So my whole goal is to find and address the root causes and give the body what it needs to restore balance itself, because I really believe that we are able to do that, and that nobody's body is broken. It just needs the right tools in order to rebalance itself. So I guess that is, in a nutshell, how I treat it. And within each of those root causes, there are lots of different tips and tricks and strategies we have, but that would take a very long time to go through.
Yeah. There's a lot of things to take into consideration, and that's why it's so important for someone to reach out for support and help, because the body is already in stress. You don't want to cause more stress.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
How do you specifically help women? Do you see them one-to-one or groups?
Yeah, so kind of both. So what happens is I run a program called Thyroid Rescue 3 times a year at the moment. And within that, there is an option to do the group program alone, which is a 10-week online group program where we go through over 72 lessons on thyroid health that are very easy to understand and digestible, and drip fed, meaning we just go through one thing at a time so it's not super overwhelming. And it includes a whole shopping list, meal plan, recipes for the 10 weeks. And we go through a gradual elimination and reintroduction. So we basically move into a really anti-inflammatory way of eating, and then gradually reintroduce foods so that people can come out with what is the optimal diet for them. How does XYZ food affect them? So then it's really about making informed choices instead of being just confused and overwhelmed. And we go through all of those root causes that we chatted about just before as well, and have a private Facebook support group, because I really am a big believer in community whenever you're trying to go through what is always a difficult process. And what's difficult for a lot of people with thyroid issues is that it's not often something where you look necessarily unwell. it's a silent thing where you are very much suffering, and a lot of the time these women have been suffering for years and it becomes their normal. So it's really nice to feel validated, feel heard, and like they're going through it with a group of people. So that's the basic version of the program. And we also have live group coaching calls where people can ask questions of me and just share how they're feeling or whatever they need in that moment, which are recorded. And then if people need more one-to-one support, then there is a version of the program where they can have 3 one-on-one consultations with me that are done over Zoom, so over a video call, and we go into more of the finer details in terms of their underlying root causes or analysing all of their test results or further prescribing extra supplements beyond what is basically recommended in the program if that's needed. And that can just be really helpful for some people as well.
Sounds amazing. I think the power
Yeah.
of the group is really important because they just realise they're not alone.
Yeah, 100%. It's honestly made the biggest difference. And I used to run it as an evergreen product where people could join anytime. And I actually found that the power of people going through the process at the same time is just invaluable.
And you've been running it for a few years now?
Yeah, about 2 years I've been running the actual program. The process I've been using with one-on-one clients for a good 5 years, but the actual program structure of it took me a good year and a half to write, to be honest, and then I've been running rounds for about 2 years now.
Cool. And what's your success rate like?
Well, so far, 100% of people who have gone through the program and done it properly, because obviously you have to actually do what I say in order to get the results, have left feeling at least 70% better. And that's, I'm saying that number as a really honest example, and also context matters here. When you think about these people who have been sick for years and years and years, to see that kind of turnaround in a 10-week lot is amazing. And I'll be the first person to say that, there's definitely, you need to continue to implement all of the foundations and all of the good health principles that are taught during the program to get that extra way, but it's completely possible. And it's so exciting to see. And I think one of the biggest shifts that happens with a lot of women is feeling more empowered in their body, and also shifting from this black and white, all or nothing, on a diet, off a diet, to more of this approach which we have in the program, which is all about progress over perfection. And I feel like that allows results to be achieved and maintained instead of it just being this thing they do for 10 weeks and then they're off it and it all just goes back downhill. And I'm really passionate about that because I can see people just stuck on this roller coaster of on something, off something, and how mentally and physically exhausting that is.
Yeah. 10 weeks is a good amount of time to actually develop a habit, and awesome to have your support to really coach people, crack the whip on them, pull them up when they're deviating, because sometimes people only allow themselves a week and they want to see change.
Yes. Yep. Yes. And that's it. You hit the nail on the head. It is that long because it takes time for the body to change and for habits to change, and for me to be able to share all of the education that I need to, as well as you heard with the root causes there. It's, each one is a huge lesson in itself. So it's so important that it is a process.
Yeah. Great. When are you running the next one?
The next one, it's open for enrollments on Tuesday, the 18th of August, but it'll actually be starting with a welcome week on Saturday, the 29th of August. So very soon.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll pop more details in the notes about that, and we'll talk about it a little bit more at the end to remind all those people with thyroid issues what they can do to help themselves. So I always find it fascinating why practitioners are so passionate about treating certain conditions. And you've had some of your own health issues. There's a few there.
Yes, there is.
Can you rattle off the list for me?
I can. So I think it all started with having anorexia. So I had anorexia for a good 10 years, I'd say. And it's hard to put a number on it because it's not like you have an eating disorder one day and then you don't. It's a gradual recovery, but I'd say about 10 years. And from that, I then got hypothalamic amenorrhea. So I lost my period and it didn't come back for a good maybe 11 years or 10 years, I'd say as well. And then I also had depression a couple of times. I had a couple of parasite infections. I almost got septicemia, which is where you get a blood infection because I had just such a low immune system. What else? I had to go on hormone replacement therapy at one point as well. And I had definitely had adrenal fatigue, but though I use that in kind of quotations because it really just was a whole disruption of the whole brain, axis talking to my ovaries and my thyroid and my adrenals. And then I also ended up having endometriosis as well once I got my period back, or I have endometriosis. So it's been a journey, Jin. It's been a journey for all of those involved, not just myself.
And you have thyroid issues? I don't know.
And thyroid issues. Yes, I missed that one out. Yes, as a consequence, definitely of all the stress that I put my body through. So I have, it's hard to word it. Was heading towards Hashimoto's. My antibodies were starting to elevate, and my thyroid levels were all out of whack. So I had an underactive thyroid, not an overactive thyroid.
So you had anorexia. Did you start putting on weight when you started getting the Hashimoto's?
Well, yes, but not straight away. So it was more that anorexia, and then I intentionally started putting on weight at a normal rate to recover from the anorexia. And then I replaced my addiction with, under eating to being addicted to performance-based sport, so CrossFit in particular. And that's when I triggered the Hashimoto's or underactive thyroid. And started putting on more weight despite not changing anything.
Yeah, right. And so that's why you're really passionate to help people with thyroid.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, let's go into the anorexia. How old were you?
About 12 and a half or 13.
Okay. And do you remember what set it off?
Yeah, I do. So I was always like a really happy, jolly kid, and I was very active and I loved food, and I had no concept of thinking I was fat. In fact, I was chubby, and I remember being called like fat or teased because I was chubby at school. But I remember genuinely thinking, what is wrong with this kid? I'm not fat. Like, it just wasn't something that landed at that time. But then my grandma on my dad's side passed away from Alzheimer's. And when she passed away, I was really upset. And it was more, we weren't that close, but she was a constant in my world. And I was very protective over her during the years where she went really downhill with her Alzheimer's. So when that happened, I just lost my appetite and I stopped eating, not intentionally to lose weight, but just I wasn't hungry, and because I was someone who ate so much and then just wasn't eating very much at all, I started to lose weight. And I noticed that a lot of people around me started giving me a lot of attention for that. And I really liked that. And I think I saw it as something that, I'm getting attention for it, I'm good at it. And I've always been someone, I would say, who wants to be the best at everything that they do. And I think I saw it as another one of those things. And it started off with me just trying to be really healthy. And so I would just try and do that. I'd try and do more exercise on top of my sport to just be better. And then as I got more obsessed and as I started to lose more weight and got more attention for it, I just continued down that path.
Mm-hmm. What was the kind of attention that you were getting?
A bit of a mix. So at first it started off as, oh, wow, like you've lost weight, you look really good, or what have you been doing? And then it turned into more of concern. And from people around me, particularly like the adults around me. So the real like admiration and the, oh wow, what have you been doing? You look so good, was coming from more my peers in about kind of year 8, I'd say. And the more concern was coming from my mum, teachers at school, my coaches in my different sporting teams, and eventually going to see a dietitian and a psychologist. I felt like I was being cared for. And I think that's what I wanted that. I think I really was playing that victim role, and it was serving a purpose.
Mm-hmm. So did you feel like you weren't being cared for within your family? Did you have that?
Yeah. I definitely think there were some elements to that. So I have a really close relationship with my mum, but my dad at that time, so my parents separated when I was about 10 years old. So I was in year 4 or so. And I had a really difficult relationship with my dad. And it was one that was definitely very unstable. So he kind of like the difficulty of it was that nothing was ever good enough, and love was conditional and very unpredictable. And there was a lot of instability in my world. So I would go to my mum's house. I would be based at my mum's house and go to my dad's house to go and sleep occasionally. But then I also had a particularly traumatic event when I was about 11, or just before the eating disorder, a couple of years before the eating disorder, where my dad took us on a holiday away for the first time, and I really hated it there. The people we stayed with were really unfriendly. They wouldn't allow us to come downstairs, and we basically, what it felt like as a child was being locked upstairs and not being allowed. And I was absolutely distraught and wanted to be taken home, but he wouldn't take me back home. So it felt as a child that I'd been kidnapped. And then from that, I had a lot of trust issues. Like I couldn't actually stay at my dad's from that point onwards. And there was a lot of guilt around that, and a lot of playing my mum off my dad. Like my dad really hated my mum and vice versa. And I just wanted everyone to love me, but I couldn't, no matter what I did, make my dad love me. So I guess there was a lot of instability and a lot of I didn't feel like I really belonged anywhere fully, and nor did I feel like I could necessarily control any situation. Like my environment, in hindsight, felt very like it was out of my control, and nowhere was really safe because nowhere was really that predictable.
That's so interesting. Thanks so much for going into that. It's kind of a common theme that I've noticed in my clients that have been through anorexia or eating disorders. What about the relationship with your mum?
Yeah, so very, very close, though I would say unhealthily close, in terms of all of my safety and all of my belonging and all of my sense of love was attached to her. So I think she never really left me as a child. Like even when my parents were together, she just never left me. And I think that's probably because she probably didn't trust my dad with me. He was never physically abusive, and he was actually a really good and fun dad when I was really young, but he wasn't very like trustworthy in terms of, my mum being confident that I was in safe hands, if that makes sense. So she never really left me. Our relationship has always been very much that we're joint at the hip. And it's a bit of a running joke in our family as well around it. And I think that my relationship with her as well was very much one of like codependency too. And I think I felt this desire to protect her, but also this need that I was only okay if I was with her. And I think that comes from the one time that I decided to be brave and leave her, my safety felt like it was threatened when I was on that holiday. And so I learnt from that moment that, being away from her equals I'm not safe. And also I also feel like what it taught me, which expressed itself later in other relationships, like with my husband, was that people who love you unconditionally don't leave you, in terms of don't physically leave your space, which has been a really interesting one to unpack too.
Yeah, I was going to say, how has all of this affected you in your future life? So the years to come,
Mm.
and now, what else have you recognized?
Yeah, well, I really struggled to go on school camps. I used to like cry absolutely hysterically, just to get on the bus, and I missed a couple of them. I went on two thanks to my best friend in primary school who actually reminded me a lot of my mum, which is probably why I got on the bus. And then I guess, from there, I didn't ever go away on holidays. I felt really unsafe whenever I would. I only went on my first overseas holiday in 2000 and maybe 18 or something, 2017, I think, which is, I think I was like, I don't know, 27 or something, but quite old. Like I just felt like I couldn't do that. And I also used to never go anywhere where I had to rely on someone else to bring me home. So to the extent where I wouldn't carpool with people unless I was the one driving, so that I knew at any point in time, if I wanted to leave, I was in control of being able to get out of whatever situation I was in. And then I think that what happened as well when I met my husband was very much that there was this sense of if he would want to go away down the coast to see his family, I would be really triggered, and it would like bring up this uncertainty in me of whether he wanted to be with me or want to spend time with me, which was really interesting because outside of that context, I wasn't like that at all. Like if you just wanted to go and do things with his friends, didn't bother me, but it was the act of going further away. And it wasn't until I connected the dots with what had happened on the holiday and how I perceived love, that I was like, oh, I see that. And once I was aware of it, it wasn't really an issue anymore.
So did you work on this yourself, or did you get some help?
Oh, I definitely got help. Actually, the foundational thing that happened was I went through my yoga teacher training, and we did a lot of kind of like limiting core beliefs work. And then from there, it opened up this whole new world for me. And I've always had quite good, like relatively speaking, self-awareness, but it brought a whole nother level to it. And I think that from that time, I just have delved deeper and deeper into trying to understand a lot of my patterns and my conditioning. And I definitely think that there's no way I could have done it by myself to the same extent. I think in order for, at least in my experience, in order for a lot of my trauma and a lot of my pain and a lot of my stuff to be released, I feel like it needed to be witnessed, because I felt very invalidated as a child. Like a lot of my struggles felt like they weren't validated by the people around me that were important to me, because my way of coping with my family situation was very I'd stick up for my brother. I'd stick up for everyone around me. I'd fight with my words and be very expressive. Whereas, my brother's coping mechanism and other people in my family as well were more like just to kind of take one for the team, to absorb it. And so I think that because I was outwardly seen as such a fighter, it was like, oh, well, she's coping, she's all right, she hasn't been affected by it, which good intentions, because I have some amazing family members and amazing people around me, but the message that sent my younger self was that my pain and my struggles are not valid. And it hasn't even been till the last couple of years of exploring some of this stuff that I've really been allowed to validate what I went through, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And just on the love thing, so I want to just talk about that a little bit more, because what I've noticed in my clients is that usually it is this feeling of lack of love, even though their parents may have given it to them. It just wasn't in a way that they wanted it. Mm-hmm. And the eating disorders was a way of getting their attention. Now, you went down a slightly different path of seeking help. You instigated that yourself. But what I often notice is the parents go and take their kids to the counsellor, to the doctor, to the dietitian, to the naturopath, to whoever, and that's their way of showing them their love for them, that they really want to help them. But a lot of my clients have said all they wanted was the love from their parents, not for them to ship them around from practitioner to practitioner.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And it's a hard one because I feel I very much had unconditional love from my mum, but I didn't have it from my dad. And I think I really desired that deeply. And his response to my eating disorder was like nothing. Like it wasn't even really acknowledged. So I didn't actually end up getting any attention or love from him at all in relation to that, despite my best efforts. And I think, I liked being shipped around to different practitioners because it felt like people cared and they were worried about me. And I liked being looked after. I liked being seen that I needed help, if that makes sense.
So do you have a relationship with your dad now?
No, I don't. So we stopped having contact when I was maybe in my last year of uni, and he is still around, like he's still alive, but we don't have a relationship at all anymore. And it was eventually my decision not to continue to contact him. I think there was many kind of opportunities and I tried really hard, but it just ended up in this kind of, he's a bit of a narcissist if I'm to label it, and it ended up just in this process of putting myself out there, trying so hard to make the relationship work, but there just being no meeting me halfway, and I would be emotionally manipulated over and over again and made to feel like I am special and maybe this is like right again and I can get this, I can find it, I can have his love, and then it would just never end up in that. And it was just, I went through years of that cycle before being like enough is enough. And I still have moments where I'd say, oh, but maybe now it would be different. But I just don't know that it would be. And I've kind of made peace with that. And it was actually, through doing a lot of therapy, through doing some plant medicine as well, that I was able to see the love that my dad did have for me to the best of his ability at that time when I was a child, and then recognizing that, his inability to show me love had nothing to do with me in the end, and that he just wasn't capable of it. It wasn't that I am not good enough or that I wasn't good enough. It's just that he just couldn't. And while I feel sad about that, I don't feel like confused by it anymore, or I feel like instead of just logically understanding that it wasn't my fault, on an emotional level, I feel like I've made peace with the fact that I didn't do anything to deserve that or didn't do anything wrong.
So what other personality traits do you think that you have that may have predisposed you to having something like an eating disorder?
I definitely think wanting to be good at everything that I do and be the best at everything. I think also there's an element of perfection, and it's really interesting to say that one because I'm really not a perfectionist in many areas of my life, but when it comes to my health and body image in the past, I very much was that way. And I think it really comes like I wanted to belong, I wanted to be liked, I wanted to be admired, I wanted to be someone or have something that someone else wanted.
Mm-hmm.
I think just being the best and being competitive. I've always been very competitive, and it was usually in a sporting sense, but I think it ended up being in a different sense as well, especially with the eating disorder, or at least that was another area where it was able to be expressed.
Yeah. So when you got into CrossFit, that was one of your outlets to be competitive and perhaps feeding a little bit of your addictive nature as well.
Yes.
How did you see the CrossFit became dysfunctional?
Yeah, so I think that, I used it as a mask. So I think I didn't at the time know, but I feel like in some part of me I did know that I was using it in order to seek validation. So I feel that I wasn't anorexic anymore and I didn't have necessarily like an eating disorder. And I felt really lost without it because I was no longer the best at something. And so I sought to become the best at CrossFit. And CrossFit is that kind of environment where, you know, if you are competitive, it's going to feed that competitive side of you because that's the whole premise of it. Like every class can feel like a competition if you have that nature. And so I really feel like it just replaced one addiction with another addiction and a way to be admired, to seek validation and to belong somewhere. And I was good at it. Like I was really good at it. And I think that that was a problem as well because I knew that I was one of the best females in the gym at that time. And I felt this need to uphold that because I guess attention for it felt like love, felt like I'm getting attention for it. People care about me and that equals love and belonging and safety.
You've got a lot of awareness. It's really great. I think you're teaching people a lot right now. It's awesome. So what was the turning point for you? What made you think something has to change?
With the eating disorder or with the CrossFit?
We'll start with the eating disorder.
So I remember my turning point really clearly with this, and it was that I was going to see the dietitian with my mum, and I had lost weight again, which I always felt really conflicted about because I was happy because that's what I wanted, but also could see how much it was hurting my mum. And my mum's not someone who really ever yelled at me, ever. And this one time that we came out of the dietitian's office and I had lost weight again and they were going to put me in hospital, and we got in the car and she just broke down and cried and said words to the effect of, you know, you're not just killing me, Natalie, you're killing yourself. And if you're going to do that, you're taking me with you. And I think I've always been a person who feels other people's emotions really deeply, and being so close to my mum in so many different ways, I felt her pain in that moment right down to my core, and it felt so incredibly distressing. And I had this realization that, you know, I can't keep doing this because I can't do this to her. And I admittedly did not want to get better. Like I wanted to be anorexic. I wanted to be skinny. It made me feel safe and good enough and in control, but I could not live with myself hurting her like that. So it was kind of from that point onwards where I started to try to get better. And it certainly wasn't, you know, just this perfect road to wellness. It was a few steps forward, a few steps back, a few steps forward, a few steps back. And I think at some point along the way, it did become more about me. And a phrase I said to my friend sticks out to me. And I think it just highlights another way of me just trying to be kind of special or unique, or think that I'm special or unique in something, which is I said to my best friend, the same one that was very similar to my mum that helped me on the bus in primary school, I said, I don't want to be the girl with anorexia. I want to be the one that overcame it. And so it was all about this just like conquering and being acknowledged for something big and bold. And, you know, I guess I did that. But I didn't ever lose the exercise addiction, Jen. I just continued down that path, and I got validation from that. Even though I'd recovered from under eating in that same way and being super duper skinny, I definitely just entered into a different way of competition. I did kickboxing, and I had this really not like a toxic instructor for my personality, which was all about how far can we push her, and everyone watch how amazing it is that she doesn't break. And So I think that was a really unhealthy thing for me to go into. And I honestly think that just, it wasn't that I overcame it. I think I just swapped addictions and form of getting what I feel like I needed. And that continued into CrossFit. And it wasn't until I started doing a lot of work on the underlying stuff and realizing that, I needed to do something differently and find out who I was underneath all that it made the difference. Although there is probably a really important part in amongst that did force me into actually going down that path of searching more into myself, which was after I'd kind of sort of recovered from the eating disorder in terms of fitting into the category of anorexia, and I was eating more, I was still exercising a lot, and I woke up one day and I literally couldn't, I had this pain in my neck, and then it started radiating down my back. And I went to the physio and they said, you just need to rest. And I instantly felt overwhelmed by anxiety because I used to exercise 7 days a week and I never took a break. And it was my way of calming my anxiety. And he said, you can't exercise. And I got really anxious, but I thought, okay, if I can just do this for a couple of days, then I can get back to the gym. Couple of days turned into about 9 to 10 months of having chronic neck and back pain. And I went to physios, osteos, acupuncture, chiro, a spinal surgeon. I went everywhere and no one could find anything physically wrong in my body. And I fell into a depression. I was quite I'd say I didn't attempt suicide, but I had suicidal ideation for a good period there. I couldn't walk further than about 10 to 20 meters, and I was sleeping in a neck brace. And I just felt completely like rock bottom. And I lost a lot of my friends because it was kind of at the time where I was going through uni, and, people just stopped calling because I stopped showing up. And it was just me and my mum again. My brother had moved out at that time, and he was someone who was a constant in my life, but he was going off and living his own life, and I felt really abandoned in hindsight. And so I was just forced into this place where I no longer had the choice to validate myself or make myself feel good or loved or admired through exercise because I just couldn't do it. So it's kind of started this big inward journey, and eventually I ended up in a doctor's office, a gynecologist and a endocrinologist who put me on hormone replacement therapy, and all my pain actually went away once my hormones started to come back online. But then I developed a fear of exercise because I was so scared of being injured and spiraling into that really low place again. And then that's when I got better, and then the CrossFit thing happened again because I'd kind of done some work, but then as soon as I got a taste of that validation again through being the best at a certain exercise, I couldn't let it go. So the CrossFit thing ended up stopping because again I got really unwell, not as unwell as the first time, but I think by that time I'd also done a lot of work in natural medicine. I was studying and I just felt like there was this huge conflict between what I was saying and telling people to do and what I was actually doing. And I think that I just did more work in terms of on myself, and it just became this thing where I was more motivated by actually wanting to heal on a really deep level and let go of, what I'd usually use to mask my pain.
Yeah, so the controlled eating and being excessively disciplined and over-exercising, where it's kind of like your drugs to suppress those difficult emotions from your childhood, perhaps.
Totally, 100%. Yep.
Then it was flawed, so you had to address it.
Yep, exactly. So it was really it's been a really long journey, and I think that there's still very much tendencies to more so I don't act on them anymore, but I definitely notice when everything is out of control in my world, my tendency is to want to control food or exercise, or at least that used to be it. The other thing that sometimes can come up, which is really interesting, which I didn't mention, is I did have bulimia at the end of my eating, of my anorexia, when I was kind of in recovery from the anorexia. I had a different eating disorder. And I noticed sometimes when I'm really, really anxious for some reason, I get the same feeling I used to get when I wanted to make myself throw up. It comes up in my body and it's like this, I need to get something out. And I notice myself being like, you should throw up. Except I never act on it anymore because I'm just aware that there's emotion in there that needs to come out, and I'll use other healthier ways. But it's really interesting how ingrained that whole situation is in there.
Yeah. So where do you put your addictive energy towards now?
That's a great question.
And exercise.
Yeah, look, I think work would be one thing, if I'm being honest. I definitely think that I've really thrown myself into running a business, and I think that's something that I have channeled a lot of my energy and effort into. I still very much care about what I put in my body and how I move, but there's not an obsessive nature behind it anymore. So I would probably say, in terms of like addictive behavior, would be this like addiction to learning, like addiction to being smart, to being intelligent, to being the person that knows the most about something. And I really have to keep tabs on myself in that way, because it's really easy for me to attach my validation to that, to being the person that someone goes to because they have this problem. So I really think that that's something that is on my radar and is probably where most of my addictive tendencies are at the moment.
Yeah, right. Now, I just want to go into the period aspect of it, because I don't feel that a lot of people with anorexia or eating disorders, or even when they just don't have their periods for various reasons, they don't consider the long-term effects of not having your period. So it's not just that your period's inconvenient, it's great, it's gone. It can affect your bone health, future fertility, all that kind of stuff. So did you actually ever have your period? Did you ever get it?
Yeah, I got it for maybe like not quite a year when I was, probably not a year, probably like maybe I got 6 periods, and then they went away from when I was probably from mid-year 7 till I was 23. I think it was when I met my husband that my period came back. So I didn't have it for a really long time, and I had osteopenia. So I definitely had very bad bone mineral density, and it's not something that I've been able to stop it going down any further, but because from such a formative age where a lot of that bone mineral density is really being laid down and solidified, I wasn't eating enough at all. To a degree, there's some of that loss that I just can't regain. So that was definitely a big side effect of my anorexia, was that my bone mineral density is definitely tracking on the lower side.
Okay. What are the other things that having an eating disorder can impact long term that you know of?
Yeah, look, I mean, definitely in terms of fertility, it can have an impact depending on how long the eating disorder is going on for. And I think also, it's really interesting. So there's a lot of observations around and a lot of discussions that I've had with practitioners who work in the space of endometriosis, and how common it is for their patients to have had a history of eating disorders. To my knowledge, there's no specific conclusive research that's been done on it at this point in time, but clinically there's a lot of discussion being had around that as an observation. So I definitely think there is an impact on hormones and inflammation. Also, it can have a long-term effect on your thyroid. So what can happen is if the thyroid is not stimulated to grow for a really long time, it can actually atrophy. So the thyroid gland itself can shrink, or you can kind of teach your thyroid to be really adaptive, like your metabolism to be really adaptive. So what that means is having an adaptive metabolism, great for survival, because it means that, it can essentially be really efficient at sucking every bit of calorie or energy intake out of food and conserving everything as much as possible. And to an extent, some people don't lose that really adaptive metabolism. So that can definitely be a long-term side effect as well. And there's some of like the most common ones I see, but the one I'm so fascinated by is the endometriosis link, but it's not something that's been necessarily studied yet. But watch this space. There's a lot of work being done in that area.
Maybe you can become the best in that.
Look, I'm going to try not to be. I'll let someone else do that one.
So you've got endometriosis, which is that I interviewed Layla a couple of months ago, who's a naturopath with endometriosis. So she shared a lot about that if anyone wants to find out more. But what have you noticed makes your endo pain worse?
Stress, honestly. Stress, because our period is like our monthly report card. Endometriosis has a lot to do with inflammation. And for me, I will, if I'm not looking after my stress and stress in all different forms, so emotional, physical, mental, chemical, all the different kinds, then I definitely notice that my period pain increases significantly. And it's something that is a constant battle to stay on top of, because sometimes life throws you things where it's hard to not feel affected by it. So I would say stress is the number one thing for me. And also, if I'm not nourishing my body with enough sleep and good nutrition, like a really anti-inflammatory diet is something that makes a huge difference to me. And it's a big reason why I am so diligent and careful, not to the point of, not enjoying eating, but just I am mindful of what I'm putting in my body, because I do really feel it and I know that it's going to have an effect. And also the amount of and type of exercise I do. So these days I do much more yoga and surfing and walking and slower stuff than I've ever done in the past.
Great. And does your thyroid affect you anymore?
Not if I'm on top of my health. If I'm not, then it definitely has a tendency to be more underactive. And it's something that I test every kind of 3 to 6 months, depending on if I notice any shifts in my own body. But if I'm on top of like nourishing myself in lots of different ways, then it doesn't play up. Though I still feel like, for me, I still feel like I'm carrying stress in my body from not having worked completely through all of the emotional stuff that's happened in my past. I think I've done really well, actually, to work through a fair bit of it. But I still feel like there's elements to my story and my trauma that hasn't completely been resolved, which I am actively working on at the moment. And I do hold hope, and maybe you can share some light on this, that even releasing some of that trauma and working through it will have a positive effect on my hormones, on my endometriosis, and on me generally, for sure.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think it's really great that you are doing the work. And probably my advice around it is just work with people who are willing to take you into that discomfort and into those painful memories, and release what never had the opportunity to be released at that time. So it's going through that discomfort in a more controlled way, knowing that you're going to resolve the other issues like the endo pain, like the hormonal imbalances. And it's hard, but it's definitely worth it.
Yeah, I agree. It's like the hardest thing I've ever done and the hardest work I've ever done, but it's also the most liberating. And I feel the more I do that, the more I feel like myself and my true self, instead of all these labels I've put on myself in order to you know, to feel like, oh, this is who I am, is I've always attached that to exercise and eating or my brain and my knowledge. Whereas the more I do the underlying work, the more I feel like I feel more at home in my body, which is something that I've struggled with my whole life. And so I think it's hard, but so worth it.
Mm-hmm. And that people will love and accept you for who you are.
Exactly.
So what is a message that you would have for other people who are going through anorexia and for the people who are supporting them?
Yeah, it's such a hard thing. I think it's really about trying to get to the bottom of like, what purpose is this serving? And I don't mean that as a insensitive rhetorical question. I mean it as a genuinely curious, inquisitive question, because I believe all of our behaviors and all of our choices are serving some kind of purpose. And it's really about asking yourself that question and getting support from people who have the ability to help you uncover that. Because I think until you find the reason why, the other stuff can help hold you up, but it's never going to heal you. At least that's been my experience. And in terms of people supporting someone going through that eating disorder process, like, gosh, it's a hard one. I have never supported someone going through it myself, but I know how hard it was for my mum. And I did a podcast with my mum on this, so perhaps go and listen to that. But I would say get support yourself. And I don't know that I have too much more advice than that, because I think each situation is different and I don't feel like I've been through that in particular. But I would just say make sure that you also look after you and not just feel like you have to fix someone else, because we can't fix people. All we can really do is love them. And I think that's something that's a really hard truth to swallow when it's someone that you love who is essentially destroying their own life.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that story and adding so much depth and all the emotions and everything that you felt going through that.
You're welcome.
So, how can people find you and work with you?
So I am on Instagram, which is natalie.k.douglas, and my website is nataliekdouglas.com. And all the information for working with me is on my website, and lots of it is also shared on Instagram. So the options to work with me are, if you have thyroid issues, then it's just through the Thyroid Rescue Program, which can come with one-to-one consults. If you don't have thyroid issues, but you perhaps have some hormonal imbalances or gut issues or are struggling with fertility, then I do offer one-to-one consultation packages as well, which you can find information on my website for. And I also run a podcast called the Holistic Nutritionist Podcast, which you can check out on all the usual podcasting apps as well.
Awesome. And you've got your Thyroid Rescue course coming up when?
So the cart will be open for enrolments on the 18th of August, and then we will begin with a welcome week, which is basically just a week to get settled in on the 29th of August. And then the week after that is when we officially start cooking our food and delving into a lot more of the information.
Great. And do you have a masterclass available?
Yes, so thank you for reminding me. So on Tuesday, the 18th of August at 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, I'm running a free live thyroid masterclass talking all about natural thyroid healing, reclaiming your energy, and really delving into the truth of what works and trying to help support people in getting the help that they need. And it will be recorded, but you do have to actually register, which you can do on my website in order to have access to that recording.
But if they turn up live, they can ask you questions in the moment.
Yes, which is much more beneficial. And I do love a good Q&A. So if they can get there live, then it's definitely more beneficial for them, because you're also more likely to absorb and take action from being live on something. I know that myself when it comes to masterclasses. I always sign up for things, and if I don't turn up live, it doesn't always get watched.
Yep, just stays in the inbox.
Yep.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge on thyroid, sharing your story on anorexia, eating disorders, and all of the backstory to it, your endo, and really look forward to hearing where you're going with everything.